Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So we saw that California's incarceration trends basically paralleled that of the nation for much of the 1980s and 1990s, and that we saw a very large increase in our incarceration rate. That was exactly the national rate. And then all of a sudden we saw this sudden change. And so what I want to do today is I want to walk through what exactly happened, what were the policy changes, what were the impetus for the changes that drove those changes, and what do we know have been the effects of those changes on public safety and racial inequality and a lot of other things. And I have very few slides, so I'm mostly just going to tell you. So first of all, it should be noted that before that change occurred, California had this sort of persistent crisis of overcrowding in its prisons. So we had, roughly speaking, a design capacity that was meant to house about 85,000 people. And at its peak, the California prison system had over 170,000 inmates. So we basically had a system that had a sort of combined, or a population that was at 200%, or roughly double the rated capacity, which you can imagine creates a lot of different problems for programming and for conditions of confinement and other aspects of running a prison system. It turned out that there were two very important legal challenges brought on behalf of two inmate plaintiffs against the system. One claiming that the overcrowding was basically preventing the system from delivering adequate health care, and the other claiming that the overcrowding was preventing the system from delivering adequate mental health care. They were both joined, and a federal court ordered the system to reduce its population to a lower percent of rated capacity. That decision was appealed to the Supreme Court by then Attorney General Brown, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And essentially, the state was forced to try to address overcrowding. And meanwhile, while that litigation was occurring, there were various smaller efforts or efforts that perhaps were less far-reaching that were trying to bring down the prison population. And then we had some truly sort of legislation that had first-order effects on the population. So I'm going to walk you through what some of those things were. So first of all, there were some moves prior to the, I'm listing four policy changes here, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the second and the fourth, but I do want to touch on some of these others because I think they're important for understanding some of the aspects of incarceration growth in the U.S. more generally. So in the lead up to that Supreme Court decision, there were several efforts to reduce the prison population by essentially reforming the way that people are admitted to prison if they're in community corrections. So for example, in 2009, there was an assembly bill passed that tried to provide a monetary incentive to counties to not revoke people's parole. The idea was that if you could lower the rate at which people were failing, not on parole, I'm sorry, in county probation, if you could reduce the rate at which people were failing on probation and therefore prevent prison admissions, then some of the savings would be shared with the county. It sort of points to a very interesting aspect of corrections in the US, that oftentimes the decision to send someone to prison is a county decision, but the sort of level of government that bears the cost is the state. And so it's kind of a free lunch on some level, right? On one hand, you can keep somebody in the community who's going to cost you money or maybe offend again. On the other hand, you can send them to the state, and the state taxpayer bears it. And it has sort of a built-in incentive to sort of overuse the prison system. That was an attempt to undo that. And that's actually a reform that you see in many places around the country that operates to different level of effectiveness. Another change that Joan was quite involved with actually was the introduction of non-revocable parole. So California was quite unique in the sense that everybody who's released from prison is on parole, so they're still under the under the authority of the state and monitored by a parole officer, which is basically a state agency that's run by the Department of Corrections. And California also failed a lot of people on parole for missing appointments, for testing positive for drugs, and oftentimes use the revocation process to send people back to prison, sometimes even when new crimes were committed. And so of the 150,000 admissions that would occur, 130,000 admissions, 90,000 would be parole violations. And the non-revocable parole was meant to define a series of lower risk people that would not be sent back to prison for a parole violation. And that did actually, as we're going to see in a few minutes, bring down the prison population some. However, in 2011, faced with the prospect of federal court basically forcing the reduction in prison populations after the Supreme Court decision, the California legislature passed Assembly Bill 109, which is commonly referred to as corrections realignment, that actually had a very, very large effect on prisons. And what AB 109 did was a few different things. Number one, it defined a class of prisoners and people who were convicted through the system that are colloquially referred to as triple non, so non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders. And in the event that you had a triple non-offense and you had no history of a serious offense, rather than being sent to prison to do your time, you're now to do your time in a county jail or probation or some mix of the two with a split sentence. And of course, that's just going to reduce the flow into prison. We'd expect that to reduce the prison population. But perhaps more importantly, numerically, is the legislation also changed who could be sent back to prison for a parole violation. So if you were serving time for a triple non-offense, rather than being released to parole, now you're released to a new status called post-release community supervision that basically was under the jurisdiction of local probation departments. And if you fail on PRCS, not necessarily a new offense, that is punished with a local sanction, oftentimes a small stay in jail. And so from 1 week to the next, we saw admissions into California prisons go from about 2,500 per week to 500 per week. It happened quite suddenly. In 2012, there was a popular proposition that was passed, 36, that revised the scope of 3 strikes. Interestingly, if we look across the country, one of the biggest contributors to growth in prison is actually lengthier sentences for people that have committed violent offenses and for people who would fit into the habitual offender category that were targeted by 3 strikes. And essentially this was meant to sort of, I guess, how would we say, kind of moderate the sentences that were handed out for subsequent felonies when they weren't necessarily violent felonies. And then in 2014, voters passed Proposition 47. And basically what Prop 47 did is it defined a series of what you might call wobbler crimes, lesser felony offenses that could either be prosecuted as a felony or a misdemeanor, and made them misdemeanor offenses. And by so doing, if you had a strike and you had a new case which was now a misdemeanor under Prop 47, you're not going to be tried for that new felony. It also meant a lot of people were getting street citations instead of being booked into jails and so on and so forth. And it ended up having a much, I think, perhaps larger effect than anticipated on local jails and prisons. So if we focus on 2011 and 2014, on AB 109 and on realignment, so what were the effects? Well, first of all, realignment is going to cause a large decline in the prison population, right, just because we're just admitting so many fewer people. But it also caused a partial offsetting increase in the jail population as people were now doing parole revocations in jail. Overall, there was a decline in total incarcerated, but it was offset to some degree by this change in the jail population. And that created its own problems, right? Because if we think of the way our system is set up, we have a state prison system, but then we have, I think, 58 counties, but 57 different jail systems. And a lot of those county jail systems were under their own court orders, right, to relieve overcrowding. And so you could imagine that when you push the responsibility down to the county, that can create other problems. Prop 47, on the other hand, ended up kind of fixing that problem, right, because you redefined a bunch of crimes as felonies and things that people would have been booked into jail for and been detained pre-trial, now they're not. And we had an immediate effect on the jail population and then also an immediate effect on the prison population. So this is just a picture. This just plots the weekly prison population in California. And basically the first red line here is this is when AB 109 goes into effect, and then this is when Prop 47 goes into effect. And you can see that over this time period, which spans about 6 or 7 years, the prison population drops from about 170,000 to below 130,000. So it's a very, very, very large change. And I think it's an unprecedented change in terms of what's happened in the United States. There's no other state that's had a change this big, and that's largely driving the picture that Joan had shown you. And then this, by contrast, is essentially what happened to the jail population, right? So you can, oh, sorry, maybe I am old. Okay, so here's Here's essentially when Prop 47, or when AB 109 goes into effect, and you see a big increase in the jail population, and then Prop 47 goes into effect, and it kind of wipes it out. And if we add the two, if we add jail and prison inmates together, you can see that the state is going from about 250,000 at the beginning of this period to 200,000 at the end of the period. So we've had a very, 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 very large decline in the number of people who are incarcerated, and subsequently we have this impact on the incarceration rate in California that was dragging down the rate for the rest of the, or for the whole country. Now, it's interesting to ask what are the impacts of this, and I'll just spend a couple minutes here and then I'll get off the stage. So one thing that obviously is of course people are going to worry about is that if to the extent that you're reducing the use of incarceration, if incarceration is reducing crime, then perhaps there are public safety implications of these trends. So there's an enormous literature on the relationship between the use of incarceration and crime that sort of thinks of different avenues by which when you incarcerate somebody it might impact public safety. So first, most obviously, if somebody's criminally active and you're removing them from society, you are going to incapacitate them and they can't commit crime, at least among the non-institutionalized, so we call it an incapacitation effect. There are people that argue that the threat of a criminal sanction may deter people, okay, from committing crime. But then there are other sort of countervailing effects that if people are cycling through a system and they're acculturating to a corrections environment that's violent and oftentimes requires people to behave in ways that are not necessarily pro-social just for the purposes of survival, that might actually increase crime to the extent when people are out, they're more prone to offending. Now, what I'm showing you here is basically, this is our violent crime rate for California from 1980 on, and this red line here is when AB 109 was implemented, right? So that's basically when all these reforms began, and this first red line is essentially the last year our incarceration rate was as low as it is now, right? So if we go back to 1990, our crime rate, our violent crime rate was relatively high, 1,100 incidents per 100,000. We go out to 2016 and we're down to, you know, sort of 450, 460 per 100,000. And this is despite us reversing our incarceration rate back to that earlier year, right? So, you know, if we think back to the conversation this morning of what determined the crime decline, yes, incarceration is in there, and they're actually, a colleague of mine and I spend a lot of time evaluating this particular effect on crime. You can find a small impact of realignment on property crime and in particular motor vehicle theft. But for all of the major Part 1 offenses, there's little evidence of a crime, despite the fact that you have some counties where the decline in the incarceration rate was over 200 per 100,000, right? So it would be as if you eliminated the prison population of European countries, and you didn't see much of an increase in any sort of serious violence. And then this is what we see for, this is for property crime. Now I should note that this little blip at the end is associated with, this is 2015, so there's some belief that perhaps there was a small increase with the passage of Prop 47, but it's not clear, research hasn't been done yet to sort of evaluate what the impact is, say, per prison year not served. Now, another thing that I'll just sort of add something, I didn't include slides on this, but I have these tabs and I can share them with whoever is interested. When you look at what happens to just racial inequality in the instance of incarceration, it actually narrows a fair amount in California. So it used to be in the sort of pre-realignment days that about 10% of prime-aged African American males were incarcerated any given day, and after it's about 7%. And you see declines for other groups too, but they're not quite as large. So we still have large racial disparities in incarceration, but they're narrower than they were before, right? Which is quite natural given the racial disparities we have in incarceration rates to begin with. And in addition, when we look at Prop 47, Prop 47 seemed to operate primarily through a large decline in arrests and a large decline in bookings for arrests that were occurring. And in the same way that these reforms have led to a narrowing of racial disparities in incarceration, they've also led to a narrowing in the sort of rate of arrests per 100,000 residents, where they've fallen more for African American and Latino residents of California than for whites. Okay, so that's it. Okay, all right.
So good afternoon. I just spent 5 minutes on campus and decided if I could have skipped this, I would. Thank you all for being here. Joan and I have known each other for a long time. Actually, Steve and I have too. We lived the era of overincarceration in California together, and it was crazy. It was, if you looked at the charts in terms of what Steve's slides don't show is what the projected trends were for prison crowding. And we did those internally. And sure, we were at 170, but we thought it was going to go to 230,000 inmates, right? Could you imagine? It's 5,000 inmates a prison, about 450 million a year for every one of those prisons. I mean, the math adds up fast. And so we did a lot of things. The non-revocable parole, sentencing changes, 678 that Steve mentioned, the parole violation decision-making instrument, everything we could do, and we bent that curve from going what should have been 230,000 to merely, losing 1,000, which was a great victory. And so we were very proud of ourselves until Jerry Brown got elected. And I was a Schwarzenegger appointee, and so I was busily packing up my office and getting ready to, go into private practice or whatever Republicans do when a Democrat gets elected. And the governor-elect called me and asked me to meet him at the Attorney General's office. And so I show up with a bunch of other ne'er-do-wells, and he talks about realignment, this concept of shifting offenders, for low-level offenders, the responsibility for those people to counties, and shifting dollars with them. And so I was intrigued and agreed to stay on the administration for a couple of weeks to help with that transition, and ended up staying for a couple of years and working together with my colleagues here. And then we saw the precipitous drops that Steve showed you. There was a time after 2011 realignment that the prison system was losing 1,000 inmates a week. In fact, I think we did that for 12 weeks in a row. The equivalent of emptying, 3 mega prisons over the course of 3 months onto the streets of California, right? Think about that. And really, nothing happened to crime to speak of. I was shocked. I had warned the governor, this is, you're not gonna like the politics of this. And he said, just go sell it. So that was my job. Joan calls me a practitioner. For most of those times, I was a salesman. And basically what I did is tried to convince the counties about what a good deal this was for them. And so, we said, you guys are brilliant, and you know more about corrections than certainly the state does. Your probation officers are fantastic. You've got to be way better than the parole agents you've been complaining about. And so we're going to give you $1 billion and the responsibilities that you've always claimed you could, if you only had, that you could do a better job. So here's your gift. Merry Christmas. And they bought it. What they didn't know, of course, is that we were really only giving them 63 cents for every dollar that I had been spending on those same offenders. And what they hadn't thought of is that they were going to have offenders in their jails for 10 or 20 years. And that those jails were made to house people for less than a year. And so there was no program space, et cetera. So I'll show you some of the impacts. The difficult part for me personally was after selling this scheme to counties and getting them to buy it, I then left the state and went to work for counties and told them they were all suckers. So you saw Steve's slide. This is just a little simpler, right? It shows the average jail population here, upwards towards 85,000. Just trending downward on its own to 2011 realignment, and then trends back up. It would have gone up much higher, but most of the jails had a cap, either a self-imposed cap or a judicially imposed cap. And so that meant one rear end comes into jail and a different rear end goes out, right? And those we just kept switching butts and seats. And those people, you just kept shortening sentences, and you would release people early, and that's why you saw a modest increase in jail population as compared to the decrease in the prison population. So as we sit today, We have approximately 82,000 inmates. Only 30,000 of those are sentenced, 52,000 unsentenced. All right, so we should probably have a whole nother talk about bail and bail reform. The way that works generally is that the rich bail out and the poor don't. As a former prosecutor, I can tell you it's a wonderful tool. If you can delay trial long enough till someone has, in effect, served their complete sentence before they're tried, it's really easy to get a plea. I'm just kidding, you guys. I'm not that cold-hearted, but it kind of is how it works for a number of my former colleagues. And so, big numbers here. Probation supervises 378,000 plus offenders, and here's the breakdown. That 35,000 number are people who otherwise would have been on parole. And 11,000, these are people who are released early from jail and through some kind of a split sentence. And so they're on mandatory supervision. And then you see your normal kind of felony probation and misdemeanor probation numbers. So big numbers at the county level. And I do think generally that we're doing a good job. The benefits, really we were forced into making evidence-based practices. I told Governor Brown that really he got lucky because he executed on prison realignment at about the exact same time that the probation chiefs started to figure out what they were doing. And that's no joke. They were, within a few years of this reform, they had just started doing really evidence-based assessments, assessing people's risk for property crime, drug crime, and violent crime. They were assessing people's criminogenic needs and making determinations about what could really be effective in changing lives. They were really looking into the science of how many offenders per agent should be assigned and what those techniques should be for supervision. And so as counties started to figure out what they were doing, that's right when they got these additional responsibilities. The other thing is that realignment included an approach that required different parts of county government to work together. And what it did is it created community corrections partnerships. And these were led by the chief probation officer, but they included the sheriff, the DA, the public defender, someone from Health and Human Services, typically behavioral health. And these people would get together, and the reason they had to get together is not because the law said so, it was because that's where the money got divvied up. And so then they would show up for every meeting because there was $1 billion to split, and everybody wanted that money. And so that really caused collaboration at the county level. The judges knew we were overcrowded and had no place to put these guys anyway, and so they started talking about alternative programming and split sentences. And judges and counties started talking about regional partnerships and those kinds of things. So really saw some good that came from that. As I said, there were realignment challenges that we never mentioned during the sales pitch. Long-term offenders are still a problem. The truth is we have no business incarcerating someone for 10 years in a county jail. There's no room for programming. There's no room for large muscle activity. There's not insufficient space for privacy during healthcare, medical treatments, et cetera, and the list goes on and on. In the meantime, the state has now funded about, I think it's 1.6 or 1.8 billion dollars in new jails to be able to handle these new offenders. So realignment is not cheap. Jail capacity and litigation. What ultimately drove me out of the Department of Corrections, and after 9 years as either the Inspector General of California or the Secretary, was federal lawsuits. In the prison system, almost everything we did except for rehabilitation was controlled by a federal judge, a judge who had never practiced in this area, who had no clue what they were doing, but was really controlling the prison system through litigation, which is also a lousy way to run a railroad. And so now the jails are seeing these same problems, same lawyers, same lawsuits, and you're going to have, in many cases, the same results, which caused great reform, right? It's just not a great way to run a system ultimately. It's a great change agent, but not a great management tool, and really expensive. And then we have, as I mentioned, treatment capacity, and Joan and I have often bemoaned the fact that we've never done a good job of measuring the impacts of all of these reforms. because it was never funded. Prop 47, as Steve already mentioned, what that does, so I won't cover that. But the concerns that you hear are, well, we were using this felony hammer to keep people in their substance use disorder treatment programs. A whole slew of arguments and disagreements about that, whether that's real or not, and whether you should be forcing people into treatment or whether they need to be voluntary to have the same kind of effects. But you're seeing difficulties in keeping people in drug court and to complete their programs because they're not worried about a felony. They know they can only be charged as a misdemeanor. At least that's the concern. Also, we were worried about increases in property crime. If you talk to I know you had a police chief here earlier. You talk to police chiefs, they'll tell you, sheriffs will tell you, they're personally convinced that property crimes are up as a result of Prop 47, but you can't always believe it, right? Because they're constantly deluged with anecdotal information from their officers about people who have said, you can arrest me all day, I'm just gonna keep going, I know it's only a misdemeanor. But we have to wait for the data to know if any of that is real. And then finally, there was supposed to be some funding that came from the savings that we could reinvest into programming, but that gets delayed. The real change is going to be Prop 57. I'll cover this just in a minute and sit down. Really, what the governor has done with Prop 57 is he's layered on indeterminate sentencing on a determinate sentencing program. So it doesn't really matter what your sentence is. After you've completed kind of your base term, regardless of 3 strikes, regardless of your enhancements, you're going to be eligible for a parole hearing. From a former practitioner, I can tell you that incenting people to program, providing them incentives to not commit offenses in prison, to show up for their educational opportunities, to take part in meaningful ways, I hope is going to revolutionize prison outcomes in California. Keep in mind that before realignment, we had a 67% return rate after 3 years. We nudged that down a little bit, again, through just really a ton of work, but that was without these kinds of incentives. So now with these incentives, I think the future looks bright. But these are governor's releases. Remember that in realignment, it was the sheriffs who had to release people. The governor just decided who was coming in and who was coming out. The same with Prop 47. Now the governor's parole officers and parole hearings officers are going to decide when people get out, and so that'll be politically difficult. I think I've mentioned these concerns, increases population. These are the things we're trying to accomplish with all of these reforms. And at the end of the day, we're trying to increase public safety. And the reason that people like me get into this business, hopefully, is to look back and realize not only that your communities are safer, but the individual human beings that are in the system. I can tell you the more of them, in quotes, the more human beings that you meet that are incarcerated, the more you realize that they're really just like you, except that they didn't grow up with the same advantages I had. And I would encourage any of you, go to a women's prison and talk to a bunch of murderers. And you'll find them, they'll be knitting or playing backgammon or something else, and you'll hear the same story over and over again. Abuse and neglect as a child, right? Self-medicating through drugs and alcohol, associating with people who got them into trouble, and then some crime that happens that maybe they didn't even pull the trigger, but were in the car when it happened, and now you're doing life in prison. So definitely ripe for reform to try to change that curve. So I'm proud of my colleagues here and for all the other people who have been working on this. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. My methodology kind of ended in 2008. I apologize. Tough crowd. But yeah, I am clean and sober, and so I came home kind of recommitted. I was in jail prior to realignment, so I can give you kind of that experience of what overcrowding was like. It's interesting, and I won't go too far into this. These are images similar to what Brown v. Plata covered. I think part of the power of that decision, some of the judges looked and said, look, it's obvious, like we can't keep doing this, right? Part of the decision used that exact language. This is inhumane. We can't continue this. And so here's kind of where we're going and where we're still going. overcrowding causes a lot of problems. For someone who's been through that, it can cause inadvertent problems in ways that violence is co-constructed. I'll give you an example. Um, the county jail I was in Alameda County, similar to this, you have very crowded situations, but you're inside of cages, so you can't come out and use the phone. And so because there's too many people for them to let out at one time, by the time they let people out, people have been waiting pretrial to use the phone, odds of fight increase. People are very anxious in general because they're in jail. They've been sitting for a few days, they can't use the phone. It's pretrial, they want to get a hold of their family. Odds of a fight are high. So there's one fight, they might lock everyone down for another 2-3 days. Same problem, right? So overcrowding causes these kind of problems, busting at the seams. And again, part of the Brown v. Plata, it's really hard to get adequate medical care to people when they're in overcrowded conditions. Makes it very difficult to manage from a management position. Moving people from prisons to county jail, I feel these reforms have done a lot of good work, but they have some downsides. And it's interesting, I don't know if people are following the Riverside County Jail strike. They're bringing up some of the issues that tend to plague county jails. Top ramen, which is one of the top commissary items people buy, is they're charging $1 per soup. In prison, you can buy a whole package. So at the county jail level, there's kind of a profiteering that's happening through companies like Canteen that are very much preying on county jail. So these facilities are not really designed for people to program. And that brings me to my main point that I want to make, being someone that promotes higher education. We're really excited about SB 1391, builds relationships with community colleges and prisons. Unfortunately, we want to see that replicated on the county jail level. And so I don't have to talk to everyone in this room about the power of education. I'm in a room full of educated people, right? But I think education has the power to be transformative for people, to kind of build consciousness, to create new opportunities for them in the political economy. And so I think education kind of moves us beyond an idea of recidivism, right? It moves people into a different lifestyle, a different relationship to their community. And so I'm going to kind of end there. I'm a real dialogue person. And so I welcome questions after the panel. After the presentation. I guess I'll end with this, and this is kind of course, I'm the Berkeley guy that does theory and hit you with a little politics, of course. If you think about it, our jails and prisons are filled with, our most vulnerable population, the poor and undereducated. I'm very informed by Dr. Peter Cilia's work, or corrections brief from 2007, was it? That talked about the average education level of prison inmate is 6th or 7th grade. And so, if we are serious about rehabilitating and kind of changing the conditions for people that are most vulnerable, that tend to be poor and undereducated overwhelmingly, then I think we need to look at what education looks like. Yeah, thanks.
I guess my first question is to David. And the experiences of serving time I think you were there when it was very crowded. And no programming in the jail.
Nothing.
And advocates thought it would be a good thing if we downsized prisons, which I think as if that was the end game. But what you talk about in the pictures you showed is the end game. Really, we've just transferred the problems from the prisons to the jails. And Matt talked about that as well. And so I guess in the world that you move in and with your colleagues and the people that you know, how would they assess the state's effort at realignment and what this balance has now become?
I think it's a move in the right direction, but what you have is a lot of people who are sitting in county jail that, again, I think he did a really good job. Matt did a really good job about talking about how they're just not designed for that. And so they miss and this is a crazy kind of situation to be in. You don't want to be like, prisons are better, or, you kind of want to stay away from that binary, right? But people will sit in county jail, and it's interesting, overcrowding actually caused me to be in a prison housing unit for a long period of time as a county jail inmate. So it's like California has already been kind of doing this pre-realignment. And so you have a lot of disgruntled people that, their canteen is really expensive. They don't have programming, which is really tough on people to just kind of sit in this like total incapacitation kind of model that Jonathan Simon and others talk about. And so people, are disgruntled. They're like, at least in prison we had this, this, and this. And so I think there needs to be some kind of, like, these facilities are not designed for people to do long periods of time. You did a really good job.
It's kind of ironic, and maybe the audience doesn't realize that actually people will say who are in the system is, I'd rather be in prison. This is, I think, for us as academics, a huge unintended consequence that kind of nobody saw coming, because the realignment law, the one thing we didn't mention, is the realignment law allowed you to send them to jail for any length of time. So you could stack sentences. A burglary plus a drug deal plus you could get a sentence up to 10, 20, years, but you couldn't go to prison because of the low severity of the crime. So you couldn't go to prison, but you could serve that time in jail, but you could serve a very long time in jail. And I think that is kind of what David is talking about.
Yeah, and if I could add one thing, and here again, it's into this realm, but it's the food in county jail. Like prisons have kitchens where people can actually make the food, and it's more whole foods kind of, whereas companies like Aramark provide the food for county jail, and it tends to be more mush, and so that is what drives people to feel compelled to spend more money on commissary than the fact that commissary has an inflated price of like triple the price of what it would be in prison, including hygiene items. So there's all kinds of moving parts to this that create the disgruntled county jail experience.
Yeah. For Matt, I'd like to ask, if you think about, downsizing was not the end game. I mean, in some ways we think of it as that. That's what Governor Brown, the Supreme Court ordered California to downsize, so we did it. We've actually been successful. We've now complied. But that wasn't what we were all working for. We were actually working for that the lives would be better of people that went through programming. And we kind of summarize it in this word reentry. Right, that we would provide services. It wouldn't be reentry to nothing. But in fact, what we've done is we've released people from both jail, prison, parole, and probation. We've discharged them. You've seen the numbers. We've gotten out of their lives, but their lives aren't any better. That to me, so what do you do about that? Because we're spending more money. We're actually spending more money if you add what he did, the three pots, the jail money, the jail construction money, and our prison budget. If you add all those together, we're spending more now than we did before we downsized. And yet, we aren't really delivering a lot of reentry services to help people going through the system. So what would you recommend to kind of solve that huge vacuum that none of us saw being created?
Well, part of what we were trying to do in reducing the level of prison crowding was just to give us a chance. Because when you have twice as many people in a prison system than it was designed for, we would, even if we had a program available at prison A, and we knew we had assessed this inmate that needed that program in prison B, there was no way to get the inmate from prison B to prison A. You'd literally have to take a bus full out of each and have them pass on I-5 and hope, that they opened up enough bunks. It was like the game used to, I'm going to age myself, but, trying to put, all the orange and purple and red squares, tiles all lined up on one of those games, right? Or it's a massive game of Tetris. It would just never worked. And so the other thing that happened, remember, Joan, is that the Great Recession happened in 2008. And within a couple of years, Schwarzenegger cut 75% of the rehabilitation budget out of the prisons. Now, we used it as an opportunity to get rid of all the programs that everyone loved but weren't evidence-based. And so that was obviously really unpopular, but it did get rid of some of that chaff that we was skeptical about whether it really worked. But we still don't invest enough in, number one, making sure that we have an individual treatment plan. We're assessing these people, and we have a real treatment plan. The correctional counselors in prisons, as you know, are just correctional officers wearing a polo shirt. And so you've got to have somebody who really is tracking these guys and making sure they're getting the right program at the right time and the right dose. And we're just not anywhere close to doing that. So I don't know why we would expect our results to be any better yet.
I guess go ahead. I was going to ask you the next question, but you go ahead.
Well, I actually think that there have been improvements in people's lives on some level. So if we think about, like, before realignment, doing some work with Matt and the Department of Corrections, I had visited New Folsom, which is level 1, level 4 together. And the level 1 dorms were really crowded. There were a lot of people there. And just a couple weeks ago, I was there for another project, and they weren't even using the top bunks, you know. And there was a lot more space. And in terms of the conditions of confinement, it was a visibly different place. And so if I think that for the people who are incarcerated, that's an improvement.
Right.
And even if someone is not receiving adequate investment when they're in the community, you know, if the alternatives are, you know, you're drug addicted and your mental health needs are not being met, but you're in the community, versus you're being revoked every 3 months, and then you're in prison for 3 months, and then you're back out for 3 months, and you're in prison for 6 months, and you're out for 6 months, and you're just sort of cycling in and out and in and out and in and out for 5 years. I don't know. I think I'd prefer the former to the latter. So that I think is an improvement. Of course, it doesn't solve the problems that many of the people that got caught up in the system face, but I don't know if that necessarily means that their lives aren't any better.
So I should have been a little more nuanced in my question. So I think the lives of people in prison today are better. What I guess, and what I want to ask you is I also think that the discharging of so many people without a plan, and you're an expert on Prop 47, so now we've discharged them from, let's say, probation and parole. They can't access many of the same programs that they could have accessed while they were under supervision. I now have people calling me. This is another fascinating, and I'm sure David knows this, and the people that have had, of what were you social advocates doing? I needed to be on parole. That was the only housing I had. You got me thrown out of my probation drug paid for treatment program. The medication was provided by probation. So simply discharging, now we've created this system where people who are those low level, which is what the low level, mentally ill, homeless, troubled, are now not able to access services. I don't have an answer. I just think it's one of those ironies that we see under Prop 47 in particular. What do you think about it? Do you see that?
Yes, I do. I do see that, and I've heard those anecdotes. At the same time, perhaps, again, this might be something that forces us to address untreated mental illness and people's problems in a serious way, rather than relying on the criminal justice system to do this. And I don't know what to say. I mean, if we're going to criminalize people for being poor and mentally ill, then there are other ways to deliver those services other than through the criminal justice system.
Well, why don't I turn it to the audience and see if we have some questions. Miss?
So taking a thread from what you've been saying and some of what we've been hearing all day as well, we want to keep people out of the criminal justice system when they shouldn't be there. So for instance, San Francisco and other places are looking at and have created something like young adult court. In the world of medicine, we know that the frontal lobe isn't developed until 24, so why not treat 18 to 24-year-olds differently than as adults and give them a chance to rehabilitate and not go back into the system and decrease and address recidivism. Additionally, there's this whole concept of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and how that actually impacts what happens to people over time. And to your point, there should be better collaboration with public health and other housing and other systems to prevent this. I'd love to hear the thoughts of all four of you on those 2 points.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a lot of good. It's interesting. Age is one of the interesting determinants. Prop 57 really goes to the heart of like us using scientific data to understand charging a juvenile as an adult is not a responsible practice based on the fact that someone's going to change their cognitive ability. It's interesting because John Pfaff has a new book out where he talks about a bunch of stuff. One is prosecutors having too much power, which I think is a big problem, and the build up to mass incarceration. Um, but he also talks about criminals aging out of crime, which is a really interesting thing. And so you bring up age, and it just piques my interest. I don't know if that's answering your question directly. I'm an abolitionist at heart, so I'm all for like a larger political discussion about different ways to treat mental health and different ways to not criminalize certain people and come up with different practices and different changes in policing. That's part of a whole different conversation. I don't know if that's part of the answer to your question. So I'm
Does
all
anybody
for
else
like
wanna address that?
alternative.
Matt?
Well, I think it's a point well taken. Certainly, it's up for a third of the people in prison are receiving mental health services. So if that tells you anything, it's a really difficult problem. And we used to when local law enforcement complained about the prison system and how ineffectual we were, and these 2 out of 3 people coming back to reoffend, I would remind them, wait a minute. These people went through your community education system. They failed there. They went to your juvenile parole system and failed there. They went to your juvenile probation system and failed. They went to your jail system and failed. They went to your adult probation system and failed. And now they've come to prison, and it's my fault, right? So the investment has to happen early and locally. And that's, I think, the message.
Sir?
Hi. That's strong. Yeah. So my question it's got 2 parts. One, I just want to say, Prop 47, the grants are available. They posted the RFPs earlier this year, so they're waiting for organizations in community and counties to access that money. It's about, I think it's $130 million right now. In regards to Prop 57, and this question is kind of for the advocacy piece, I believe it's in the public input phase on how to improve it to help folks get through. You could talk a little bit about that public input process, because I would think some of the folks here would have great ideas on how to improve it to make it more effective.
It's going on right now.
Yeah.
Right now, between now and the end of August. You can go up to the CDCR website. There are the regulations there, and there's a button there that says post comment, reactions. So that's one way, and I'd be happy to talk to you after the panel about any other ways of doing that. Mark?
Sorry, Celia. You can also. Oh, I have a mic. I'm okay. So, I've been very curious for a long time. So I've done a lot of research on California's Medi-Cal program, which is provides health insurance for right now 12.5 million people in California, none of whom currently are incarcerated. And I've studied actually treatment of people with mental illness and how that's evolved over time in response to new treatments and so forth. And one thing I just have absolutely no idea about, and I would love to hear, I think, Matt, you're the person most likely to know, but maybe others, is just who in the system is making the decisions about A, who gets treated, and B, what treatment they get. Because there are, let's take schizophrenia, there are 10 different pharmaceutical products on the market, and they differ enormously in their prices. And so you can have one product that's $500, $600 a month, and another that's $30 a month for a prescription. And financial incentives, I'm a believer they have a huge impact in the healthcare system. And I'm just so curious about how does it work? Because I've tried to get some data on it. It's very hard to get data. So anyway, can you have a crack at that?
Sure. Well, just as an aside, we went and recently, at least under the last administration, and lobbied the Obama administration to include incarcerated adults in the Medicaid program. And of course, it's way too expensive for anybody to want to chew on that. But there's a treatment team model, and so they're assessed upon entry, and then if they have a history of mental illness or if it's flagged, then they get a more formal assessment by a practitioner, and their treatment is through this treatment team model. I think that treatment in a locked setting is really difficult. It's a stressor, period. And you have, I just think part of our lack of success is that we're trying to treat people's mental illness in a setting that makes it really difficult to do so. It's not for want of paying for it. We spend twice as much money per inmate as the next highest state, which is New York, and our results are no better. So, how's that for depressing Friday afternoon?
Cowboy Smith.
Thanks. I have a question for Steve. This has all been about sentencing, but you were talking about the police, and it's worth going back to them for a second. One mechanism for decarceration is not arresting people in the first place. And there's a point I want to clarify. You said, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, that an effect of Prop 47 is that it led to police not arresting in cases that they used to arrest. Is that true?
Well, what you see, if you plot out the time series of arrests for offenses that were redefined under Prop 47, is there's a discrete drop.
Yeah.
First of all, there's a switch in terms of the classification from felony to misdemeanor, and then overall there's a discrete drop.
What confidence do you have? I realize you may not have studied this particular point about causality there. In other words, is it the police really want arrests that will lead to jail or imprisonment and feel less motivated, or what? I can imagine any number of motives.
So I've heard anecdotal stories of officers saying we can no longer arrest this person for Prop 47, and actually being wrong, right? Because these things are still misdemeanors and they can issue a street cite. But if you look just at the data, I mean, it has to be, because it's literally from 1 month to the next, there's a decline in drug arrests. There's a decline in arrests for property crime. And, and of course, and then there's the switching in categories, and then there's also decline in the arrests that are booked, because if they're a misdemeanor, it's booked at a much lower rate. So clearly, when we saw that immediate impact on the jails, that was operating through declined bookings, either because they're substituting towards street citations or the arrest, but the data seemed to suggest that there really was almost like a pullback in enforcement. And I don't think that was the intent of the law, but that's how it's played out.
Which is a complication when we look at crime rates, right? Justin?
I was curious what's been the available evidence on how gang organization has changed in the wake of realignment within prison gang.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you, there's been a massive effort to get people out of secured housing units. Long-term isolation. There was a massive hunger strike when I was the secretary. We had to begun some reforms in that area. It increased the acceleration of those reforms. So 2/3 of those people are now in normal prison settings and doing just fine. So you have a from my perspective, the crowding made it very difficult for officers to deal with the prison gangs. But they're still a powerful force. And mostly what'll break your heart is that prisons are some of the most segregated places in America, prisons and churches, right? But that's mostly enforced by gangs.
It's an interesting question. I think we know nothing about that. And do you think, Matt, given you have such experience in that incentivizing inmates to program, to get out early, should maybe break up the control of the prison gang?
Yeah, I hope so.
David, do you think there's any real, or the people are so committed that it's not going to matter?
Well, it's a dangerous thing to not, to say no to an instruction from someone who's running a true prison gang. The Mexican mafia does not play. And so, but on the other hand, there's lots of people who have done it, and incentivizing people and recognize your freedom's on the line. I think that, people could rise up and we could.
It'd be a really interesting study.
But you shouldn't underestimate how scary it is to say no in a locked setting to someone who is threatening you.
Sir? Oh, I'm sorry. Are you doing it? I'm sorry.
I was curious if you could share, thank you all, first of all, very interesting. If you could share your vision for a truly de-mass incarcerized nation where campaigns like Cut 50 talk about cutting the prison population, but I'm curious about scalable ways to get at that when violent felony really is going to be the piece that will make that happen or not, especially given the comments around trauma and that the role that that plays in the prevalence of violence in crime.
You want to go, David? I'll offer some thoughts after David.
Yeah, I think there's so many moving parts to how we got here, right? Starting to undo it, I really recommend what's kind of situated in a lot of the literature that's coming out. Naomi Murakawa writes a book that talks about how liberal reforms actually led to, parole officers were originally supposed to be like social workers. So I think part of it is we need to move toward this. I'll get to your violent question too, because that's always the hot topic one. But I just want to go kind of piece by piece. I think we need to move to like someone comes home, there needs to be like wraparound services for them, right? Like looking at what felony disenfranchisement does to people, the fact that you are not that identity, right? I think I embody that in a lot of ways, right? And even, before policing, again, I want to go back to like prosecutors have way too much power. It's not realistic to tell a person you can take 3 years or you can go to trial and we'll give you 20. You know what I mean? It just sets up a situation where it's like the deck is stacked against you, especially if you're a poor person and you come from certain communities. It's just the odds are really against you. Here's the thing. I think part of this trail of like focusing on private prisons and the drug war is kind of it's a really small percentage, right? More and more or the high percentage is violent crime. So we need to come to a new understanding of how do we sentence that in a reasonable way. And I don't have you know what I mean? I'm not a policy person. I'm a theory person. I want to theory my way out of this, right? But I also can just tell you from lived experience, it's like I have violent crimes on my record. And so we need to find ways to make that more meaningful. Maybe that's just an idealistic answer, but I think there's something in kind of a lot of small fixes.
Steve, did you want to address that or move on?
Well, yeah, I actually think that's maybe idealistic, but also kind of a practical answer. And I'll just draw a lesson from realignment. So in many ways, there are ways that you can score people's risk, right? The risk of recidivism, the risk of violent recidivism, what have you. And one of the interesting things about the people who were defined as triple nons or eligible for PRCS versus the people who stay on parole is there's actually overlap in the risk distributions, that there are people who are riskier that we defined it as triple nons than people who are, no, you have to stay on parole. And a lot of it is because we defined who was in that box relative to that box based on the offense they committed, and violent offenses put you into a certain box. And it turns out that just from a sort of crime prevention point of view, it's a lot of times the person who has a violent offense as a young person that actually as an older person is really not that criminogenic, right, and is probably a good bet. And I think that in terms of using prison more sparingly, I think it requires things like, sort of pretrial detention should be determined by risk and not whether you can make bail, or whether you have the money or access to resources, or perhaps adding a level of indeterminacy to your release date to incentivize programming and to act as a check on the deal that a prosecutor struck and sort of alter the bargaining position a little bit, right? So I do think that there's room. And in essence, yes, we've had problems with realignment, but we've also had a massive shrinking of the number of people that any day are denied their freedom. And we really have not had a big increase in crime. We haven't had anything of what sort of people would naturally say, oh, this is what I expect to happen. And it's not inconsistent with the research on this question, right? Because a lot of the empirical research on incarceration and crime was suggesting that there's diminishing marginal returns, and that at the levels we were incarcerating people, we wouldn't expect big effects. But we have this demonstrated, example, proof of concept, and you would think that other states that have higher incarceration rates than us, or counties that use incarceration rate at a high rate, suggest that there's room there to be more judicious in the use of this particular tool.
John?
I'm curious to what extent realignment has put more power into the hands of county sheriffs and what their role is in this process. The reason why I ask is that Trump invited sheriffs from around the country to come to the White House. You may have seen that he said, nobody will tell you this, but the murder rate is the highest it's been in 47 years. And not one county sheriff actually questioned him on that. I wasn't sure whether they didn't realize that what he was saying was nonsense. But in any event, we now have the county sheriffs empowered in this way, and I'm wondering what role they play, either positive or negative, since realignment has been put into place.
I can take it, or Matt can take it. Why don't you work closely with him, Matt.
Yeah, I don't. I think actually the sheriffs are becoming more enlightened rather than less. And so giving them responsibility to rehabilitate people over long periods of time. They're including programming space in these new jails to an extent we haven't seen before. They're starting from a way back here, because that was never their job. And so they've had to come a long way to catch up. But most of them that I talk to recognize the fact that, they've learned through Dr. Peter Celia that 95% of these people are coming back. And so it's in vogue for sheriffs to talk about their programs and what they're trying to do. So I think, that's a positive. It's just an expensive, difficult place to do that.
But I think, John, you're very right that sheriffs gained a lot of power in realignment, because they became now the parole board. So they can lock them up, they can let them out. They have all the power that I used to say when I was working for Matt, kind of, if he had had the power that the sheriffs now had, we could have solved prison crowding, because they have the release valve that the state prison system never had. That was what they got in realignment. Just one thing, since FAF has been mentioned twice, Prop 57, if you're interested, reduces the power of the prosecutors. It now brings the power back to the CDCR. It institutes a parole board, and it allows that parole board to reduce all of those enhancements, all those consecutive sentences. So Governor Brown has been quite brilliant. He has systematically reduced the power of the prosecutor that has been increasing over time, which is, of course, why all the DAs were against it, because he now has all the power. The power never goes away, it just shifts. He grabbed it all, and that's where it now lies. One more question, sir?
Thanks. So I appreciate the focus a lot on this panel in thinking about the way that crime categories reinforce themselves, right? The more you have people in prison, the more you're entrapping them in a life trajectory that is reinforcing, which I think stands in fairly strong contrast with some of the things that we talked about in earlier panels about refining policing and making policing practices more effective and enforcement more effective and these sorts of things. So I wonder if and we just kind of spoke about this a little bit, that the change here shifted a lot of the incentives, right, within the system for DAs, but also for like what police would do. What kinds of resistance has there been between, say, the power of police and the way they might, say, police unions, to how enforcement would take place if there isn't the same structure of incentives to put people in prison? So, I mean, I suppose that I'm kind of asking here, how would we think about these new kinds of ideas like predictive policing and AI and all that? How does that fit with a shrinking prison population, for example?
Well, I do think that there is, Attorney General Harris, Senator Harris, wrote a book, Smart on Crime. The idea is simply to use resources in a more scientific way to try to get more with less. And I think that a lot of these moves to efficiency, and if we think of all of the different tools we have to address crime, incarcerating people is one, investing in people is another, policing people is another, and we want to find that sweet spot where the bang per buck is equal across the interventions, right? And so perhaps, if we sort of constrain one tool, it causes us to look for other tools that are going to be effective. I thought you were asking a slightly different question, though, which is how certain actors in the criminal justice system, if they don't like the reform, could possibly get around the reform. And so, for example, with realignment, one thing that people were concerned about was, before the prosecutor with the new felony would come in, and they'd release to parole, they'd defer to parole, who would just violate the person back to prison. Now they can just prosecute the person instead. So you might see more people coming in on second strikes or third strikes or more prosecutions. And there was evidence that some of that happened, right? That your likelihood of being convicted conditional on arrest for a CDCR releasee went up, okay, but by a small amount. So, in any of these situations, given that there are different tools and what we see before and after is the result of discretion being exercised in the system, some of it can be undone by actors. But we didn't see that happen overall because we had declines in these populations.
Well, I think we're out of time, and I want to thank Mark in particular for hosting all of us, and join me in thanking our panel.